I'm delighted to be here after 7 years of being a loyal attendee and consumer of the Emerging Markets Forum. The organizers finally decided to give me a speaking slot, albeit it's not in the most attractive hour right after lunch. So thank you all for listening. This morning, we've heard and had a very robust discussion on issues related to investments in Africa, mostly centered around what businesses can do. I'm going to shift the conversation by maybe 180 or perhaps even 360 degrees and take you on a journey through South Africa. And this journey is really a story about addressing the scourge of HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a story about some false starts, some missteps, and some resets. I don't have the time today to get into the details of all the research, but I do want to leave you with one key message, and I think that's succinctly summarized in the title of my talk. It's the pitfalls of decontextualized products and solutions. And to put it very simply, if you're planning to do business in Africa, and if you want to take products to the market in Africa, do spend the time that it takes to understand the continent and its people first. As we heard from so many speakers this morning, this is not one unitary large landmass with a homogeneous group of people. It's a continent with incredible variety, with lots and lots of heterogeneity. And if we don't take that into account as we design our products and solutions, we're almost set up for failure from day one. A project of the size that I've been working on could not have been accomplished with the contributions of many, many people. So I want to start by acknowledging the rest of the research team. As you can see, this is a very multidisciplinary, diverse team which comes from many different sources. The leads on this project is the Division of AIDS, the Prevention Sciences Program team, Fulvia Veronese, Gina Piper, and James Cummings. This is part of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at NIH. Our boots on the ground team, Kantar TNS in South Africa, Lara Burns, Louise Kenmore, Ahmed Amin, Duru Nafa, and Lachlan McHarry. Big thanks to them for all of their heavy lifting. Our CHIDS team at the Smith School, my colleagues Gordon Gao and Kenyon Crowley. But I think most importantly, the hundreds of South African adolescents and young women who spent lots of time with us, told us their stories, their hopes, their fears, their anxieties, and really allowed us to get this very deep, nuanced understanding into this market that we're trying to penetrate. And then finally, we had a panel of 30 experts, biomedical scientists, behavioral economics researchers, psychologists, economists, comment and critique the findings of the study, so we're grateful to them as well. So let me start by noting that I have no conflicts of interest to report, since this is a study in the healthcare domain, and I will be presenting some findings, and also acknowledge the support from NIAID, NIH for this work. All right, so let me roll the clock back maybe a little over 3 decades and remind you about HIV/AIDS in the United States. Some of you might recall that the 80s was characterized as the decade of the AIDS epidemic in the United States. In fact, the first known case of HIV/AIDS was identified in June of 1981. Today, there are approximately 700,000 people who have died since the start of the AIDS epidemic. And at the present time, there are 1.2 million people in the United States living with the condition of AIDS. I put 1995 there as well as a key date to remember, because 1995 was the time which saw the inflection point in the decline of the prevalence of HIV/AIDS in the United States. That was the time when some outstanding therapies and vaccines were developed, specifically heart therapy for some of you who are familiar with the medical advances in this field. And from that time onwards, from that time onwards, you can see the sharp decline in the incidence of HIV. The picture, however, is not quite as rosy in the continent of Africa. When you ask a person on the street who amongst men or women is more likely to be afflicted with HIV, 9 times out of 10, the response that you will get is men. And that's because HIV is typically perceived, and erroneously so, to be a disease that afflicts men. This is not true. It is true to some extent in the United States, but it's certainly not true in Africa. In data collected by the NIH, you can very clearly see that the prevalence of HIV amongst men and women is strikingly different. This chart shows you the purple bar is women and the blue bar is men. This chart shows you that across all age groups, women are more likely to suffer from disease from HIV than men are. In fact, in 2016, there were a total of 1.8 million new cases of HIV infection identified in the entire world. Of these, 43% were in Eastern and Southern Africa, and more than half of these incident infections were in women. Given these statistics, and given what we heard from two other speakers this morning, in fact, I was happy to see the same chart put up by Mr. Zubek during his remarks. Southern South Africa, sub-Saharan South Africa, is experiencing a demographic dividend. Yes, there is a growing population of young people. In fact, 1.2 million people aged between 10 and 19 years, which is 1/5 of the global population. But if you think about the growth of young people, if you think about the growth of population, and in particular, if you think about the growth of population as it pertains to young women, and you connect the dots from the previous slide, you can immediately see that there's a growing vulnerability here, that sub-Saharan Africa does suffer the risk of an increasing epidemic of HIV/AIDS if it's not contained very soon, and especially amongst young women. So given this backdrop, clearly the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and particularly the Division of AIDS, whose mandate it is to define the national research agenda for HIV prevention strategies and also to develop treatments that could be applied the world over, a big priority on their agenda is to understand how to address the scourge and the potentially growing epidemic of HIV/AIDS amongst young women in sub-Saharan Africa. So over the years, a number of investigational products have been developed, investigational products that both treat the disease, but then equally help prevent the disease before it even occurs. And some of these investigational products have shown very promising results in early stage trials. So clearly, the next step is to take them to some large-scale field trials, and that's exactly what happened. So in the past couple of years, there have been two very large-scale trials that have been held in sub-Saharan Africa related to HIV prevention strategies amongst young women. The VOICE trial, which is the vaginal and oral interventions to control the epidemic, phase 2B placebo-controlled randomized trial that enrolled over 5,029 young women between the ages of 18 to 45 at 15 different sites in 4 countries. The second trial, the ASPIRE trial, similarly enrolled a large number of female participants, 2,629, again between the ages of 18 to 45 at 15 sites. And findings from both of these trials were reported in the New England Journal of Medicine. Let me also underscore that both of these trials were using treatments, therapies that had been shown in laboratory and small-scale tests to be highly effective. In other words, they would prevent the incidence of HIV before it even occurred. However, as it turns out, these were very expensive missteps. And I quote from the scientific papers summarizing these results: "None of the drug regimens we evaluated reduced the rates of HIV acquisition. Adherence to studied drugs was low. HIV prevention was not observed for women between the ages of 18 and 21 years, the exact target group for whom we hoped to develop remedies, and objective markers of adherence were lower in this subgroup than in those older than 21 years. So what did we learn? We learned that we built it and they did not come. We learned that these products were effective, but they were not being used. And in subsequent debriefs of these women as to why they were reporting misuse of the products to the investigators and why they were, in fact, sharing falsehoods about taking the product during the periods of the trial, they identified so many different considerations that the investigators had not even thought of. As an example, one of the girls complained about the bottle of pills rattling in her purse when she went out with her friends. And when that bottle of pills would rattle, her friends would turn around and say, "What is it that you're carrying in your purse?" And there was an immediate sense of stigma associated with that. So these are things that were completely unknown to the investigators when they embarked on these extremely expensive trials, which turned out to be failures. So 2 key lessons emerged from these missteps. The first lesson is that the behaviors of adoption and sustained use of any product take place in the milieu of an extremely complex sociocultural context. And if we don't pay attention to that, the complexity of that context, which is defined by so many colors, so many behaviors, so many different attitudes, if we don't understand that, then we are marketing to people that we absolutely have no clue as to what their motivations are. Second, because HIV prevention products delve into very sensitive issues of sexuality, of stigma, keeping psychological considerations front and center is absolutely critical to any successful product marketing strategy. So we stepped back and we said, how do we understand the experienced reality of these women in their day-to-day lives? And we formulated 5 research questions that would guide our subsequent investigations. So let me show you what those questions are very quickly. First question was, how do we really describe these young low-income women that we're targeting? What are the types of words and adjectives and metaphors that we can use to put our arms around this market? Second, what are their specific attitudes and beliefs and behaviors and interests, especially when it comes to questions related to virginity, to contraception, to the types of sexual relationships that they might like to have, to the attitudes that they have about risk, to how salient the risk of HIV infection is for them. Third, how does being female influence their lives? How does it constrain what they can and they cannot do? We heard from our previous speaker that there is a bit of paternalism in Africa, and certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, men are given a place in society which is significantly at a higher pedestal than women are. So the question is, do these women have choices? Can they self-determine what they want to do in regards to the types of medical treatments they avail of? Fourth, we wanted to understand, well, what are the products that these women consume in the context of their femaleness? Clearly there's a market for beauty products, there's a market for a whole range of women's products. And what are the brands within these markets that are attractive to these women? And importantly, why are these brands attractive? What is it about the brands that creates that affinity between the woman and the product? And then finally, because the challenge that we were facing is to persuade women to adopt a product, to engage in some behavior change, who exactly is influencing what they do? And these influences could come from the physical world. It could be community elders. It could be, social health professionals, medical health professionals, their parents. But equally, because sub-Saharan young women are no different from young women the rest of the world, we heard about the penetration of ICT, the penetration of mobile phones by multiple speakers this morning. And clearly, cyberspace is a place where these young women spend a lot of their time. So how can we discover who their influencers are in the digital world as well? So armed with these 5 questions, we designed an extensive research project to try and unravel some of these complexities. And our project was very loosely titled. It's got many words, but we had to have many words to describe the complexity of what we were trying to study. So the project is loosely titled Promoting HIV Prevention Among Low-Income Women in South Africa, Behavioral, Sociological, and Product Marketing Opportunities and Challenges. Given, as I said before, the detail and the difficulty in what we were trying to do, we figured that the best way to approach it was through a mixed methods design using a combined qualitative and quantitative study. So there's 3 aspects, and I'll describe the actual study in just a minute. We did a lot of desk research and expert in-depth interviews, detailed ethnographies to truly understand the lives of these young women, and then finally a large-scale survey to unpack some of these answers in a more systematic quantitative way. So here's a quick look at our extensive qualitative data. We had 11 subject matter experts ranging from sociologists to public health workers to community leaders. Depthnographies where 32 young women were observed for a period of 3 days each in situ, in other words, in their home settings, interacting with their friends, their parents, anybody else who came to their house during those 3 days. 8 digital savvy participants who wrote an autoethnography. For 3 days, they documented in an online journal what they were thinking, feeling, doing, the sites they were visiting. Hostess home groups, where we put people together in groups of 3 so that we could see how social influences and peer effects played out in their responses towards HIV and prevention. And then influencer IDs, which is in-depth interviews with their mothers, their aunts, the village elders, community leaders, and anybody else who had influence in these young women's lives. There are voices missing from this, and to address those voices, which is the voices of the men, we did 6 additional interviews where we studied the girl in conjunction with her partner and had them converse with each other about prevention in general and HIV in particular. So very quickly, a preview of our qualitative findings. There's too much rich detail to summarize in a 20-minute presentation, but I will try to give you a feel for what we heard. So we found 5 distinct themes that define womanhood in sub-Saharan Africa. Sisterhood and support, the notion that women support each other, but equally they're also competitive with each other in how they compete for partners, they compete for resources, and for a whole host of other things. A theme of strength and resilience, that women are taught that they must endure and they must be strong through any kind of obstacles they face as they move along. A theme of sex and promiscuity. Often engaging in sex was considered to be a ticket to acceptance within your peer group because you were defined as being with it and progressive, and many women engaged in promiscuous sex purely as a way to get acceptance into their peer social group. There's an interesting tension between the sex versus promiscuity theme and the theme of virginity, where in sub-Saharan Africa, virginity is often viewed as a form of social capital because virginity is what gets you accepted in your community, in your church, and amongst the elders. So there was an interesting tension there. And then finally, the cultural rites of passage are important in defining womanhood because in some traditions, in the Zulu tradition, for example, there are certain things that have to be done before a girl can formally be inducted into womanhood. So these themes, and again, there's a lot of detail and insight buried under them. These themes gave us the first glimpse into the complexity of the lives and thoughts and motivations and behaviors of these young women. I want to underscore one important idea that emerged in our qualitative study, and that is around the enormous information deficit, the enormous lack of high-quality knowledge about health in particular, and about reproductive health, sexual health, and prevention in particular. The information deficit was staggering. Let me give you an example of that. So one common myth or misconception amongst these young women is that some health products can act as spermicides after sex. In other words, they can stop contraception after sex occurs. One product in the in the market is something called Flagyl. I don't know if anybody in the room is familiar with Flagyl, but if you know Flagyl, it's an antibiotic, and it's used to control all types of infections. Well, these young women were taking it after sex, which might have been taking place outside of marriage, so it could be promiscuous sex, which could lead to a risk of HIV infection. These women were taking Flagyl after sex, believing that it would control sexually transmitted infections and it would stop contraception. So they were substituting Flagyl for contraceptives, for condoms, not realizing that they were not saving themselves from anything and they were not preventing any type of bad occurrence from occurring. So where are they getting this information from? Unfortunately, they're getting it from community health workers. Unfortunately, the clinics have nurses that are perpetuating these myths and misconceptions about pharmaceutical products. So no wonder, even drugs that have proven to be efficacious in other settings, have proven to be effective in other settings, have not been robustly adopted by these young women because that's the kind of information that they're getting. Okay, so armed with the insights from our qualitative data, we designed a quantitative study to more systematically and more rigorously explore these young women and try to understand what types of categories they might fall into. So what we did was 1,500 interviews, and our target respondent were young females between the ages of 14 to 25 in the Living Standards of Measurement 4 to 7 scale, which is where 8 to 10 are the middle class and affluent, and 1 to 3 are the ones who are really at the edge of poverty. So 4 to 7 is somewhere from towards the middle of the socioeconomic spectrum. And we weighted the sampling by LSM and by region. We conducted the study in 3 different regions, metro and semi-urban. We also did random suburb sampling with area and age quotas, and the survey was administered through a face-to-face interview. It lasted about 40 minutes. There was a very large number of variables, more than 300 variables included on the survey. I'll just give you a preview of what we were trying to do there. There was no mention of HIV, AIDS, or prevention on the survey, right? Because our insights from the Voice and Aspire studies told us if you use words like HIV prevention, you're only going to get lies and falsehoods. So we pegged the survey question to 2 specific feminine products, deodorants and sanitary protection. And we asked about product preferences, about brand affinity, about the channels that they searched for these products. We also asked them a lot of questions about their risky behavior, their sexual health, their sexual preferences, and a whole host of other things. So this was a very extensive set of data. As I said, more than 300 variables. And after we sat down and statistically analyzed this data, we came up with 6 differentiated segments. Each segment is very distinct on the basis of a number of different variables. I won't have the details to get into that right now, but I'll just share with you some of the descriptive labels that we developed for these segments because they kind of highlight the key distinctions amongst these young women. The responsible mother, the good girl, and the liberated survivalist make up about 60% of our sample. The conservative survivalist comes next at 17%, and then the protection sensitive and the gender prisoner round out the typology at 100%. This is an abstraction, so let me try and bring this to life for you if I could. And I'm going to introduce you to Zola, who is our prototypical good girl. And here's how Zola would describe herself. She would say, my name is Zola. I am 16. I am an only child. I live with my mother and grandmother. I know that education is my ticket to earning more freedom from my family's expectations. I want to succeed more than anything else, and I am in an environment that allows me to thrive. What else can I tell you about Zola? She would love to date, but she's forbidden by her family. And because of the social and family pressure that she experiences, she decides that she doesn't want to be promiscuous, she doesn't want to engage in sex, and she's willing to give up acceptance by her peer group because she prefers to be accepted by her family and by the society in which she lives. However, The net result of this is that there is a mystery that surrounds sexual activity. There is a shroud of secrecy around sexual activity, which makes Zola extremely vulnerable to the risk of HIV infection once she goes out there and once she breaks away from her family. This is just one example of one of those segments, and we could be here all weekend talking about the rest of the study, but I hope this gives you some vivid feel for the many, many different types of young women that we've encountered and tried to segment in this study. To give you one final example of our study's findings before I wrap it up. So one of the questions that was of great interest to us is, which segments are most vulnerable to contracting HIV? And what you see over here on the left-hand side is a risk score that we derived from the data based on a number of variables, a number of responses about risk preferences, sexual activity, the number of times they dated, et cetera. So this is the derived risk score. And then we asked the women directly, what do you think, how vulnerable do you think you are to HIV infection? Right at the end of the survey. Remember, 40 minutes, no mention of HIV, and then right at the end of the survey, we asked them to assess their own risk, their own perceived risk of vulnerability. And as you can see from this chart, there are some pretty striking differences between the derived risk score and the perceived risk score. So even though we know from the data that these women are quite susceptible to HIV infection, they themselves don't perceive themselves to be quite as susceptible, or at least the numbers don't match up so well. Okay, so we're certainly not done with this study. We have a lot of next steps that we're currently engaged in. We have many, many more insights to extract from the data. Right now, we are looking at some advanced machine learning, natural language processing tools to try and wade through the reams of transcripts and the hours of video recording that our qualitative study gave us. We are extending the study to some parts of some rural areas because so far our focus has been on urban and semi-urban. We want to engage men more because eventually the scourge of HIV has to be addressed through partnership between men and women, an agreement that prevention is important, an agreement on the terms under which prevention will take place. Once that is done, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases will be supporting some randomized trials where we're going to explore the effectiveness of different type of messaging through different types of channels. We want to use, this is not a cell phone, but we want to use the cell phone, social media, all types of channels to intervene with the right kinds of messaging around HIV prevention and see what works. We want to understand who the key influencers are in both the physical and digital channels. And then finally, what's the best way to reach these women? Which channel will be most effective? Is it mobile? Is it social? Or is it just face-to-face conversations with community elders? So to wrap up, everything that I've tried to communicate in the last 20 minutes and all the work that we've been doing for the last 4 years, I think the story is not new in many ways. The fact that marketers have known, in theory, at least for some time, that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work, that part of the story is not new at all. I think what's new here is perhaps the fact that a trending term in medicine, health, and treatment is precision medicine. Right? We talk about precision medicine in many different ways, about developing drugs and therapies and treatments that are customized to the specific genotype and phenotype of the individual. I think equally for promoting healthy behaviors of the type that I described, such as taking advantage of HIV prevention techniques and treatments and vaccines when they're available, that type of healthy behavior also has to be triggered through the appropriate design of interventions. And part of our research program is to understand what interventions work for whom and under what circumstances. So think of this as the promise of precision medicine in health and treatment, and more importantly, in changing behavior. I also want to say that for anybody who's involved, not necessarily in the health context, but in any other context, in designing products for markets in Africa, don't for a moment ignore the sociocultural context. I may be preaching to the choir here, but don't ignore the sociocultural context. And the composition of the research team or the product marketing team is absolutely critical. As you saw from my first slide, there were so many scientists from so many different disciplines who came together. I'm not trained in biomedical science. I have many amusing anecdotes to relay about. It took me 2 months to learn how to say pre-exposure prophylaxis appropriately, and my tongue still can't wrap itself around tenofovir. But I'm getting there, right? So there are many communication barriers that have to be crossed between scientists from different disciplines, but I think the end product is much more robust and much more impactful than if just the biomedical scientists had gone at it alone. We would have spent lots and lots of taxpayer dollars for no outcomes because the women were just not using these products. So my closing recommendation to everybody is, let's talk about heterogeneity in treatment effects. Let's talk about variations amongst people, differences amongst people that are going to condition their responses to everything that we do, whether it's selling them a soap or a shampoo, or whether it's selling them a set of condoms or a treatment for HIV prevention. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.